in the Anglican Diocese of Rio de Janeiro, where he serves as Dean of St. Luke's Episcopal Church. Dr. Coelho is a member of the National Liturgical Committee of the Episcopal Anglican Church of Brazil. He helped to devise the 2015 Book of Common Prayer in Brazil and now serves as the custodian of that Book of Common Prayer. Thank you very much, Dr. Coelho. We are glad to have you with us. We'll now shift gears a bit and have an opportunity to hear from Dr. Ueti in his pre-recorded lecture.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have accepted Dr. Briet's invitation to be in this dialogue with all of you about liturgy and inculturation, or the inculturation of the liturgy. It is also a pleasure to share this beginning of a dialogue, which we hope to continue at other times, with Dr. Luiz Coelho, my colleague in the theological journey, committed to the life of all people and to the task of challenging our minds, personal and institutional bodies on the path of the spirituality of the kingdom. I'm sorry I cannot be live with you today. I had another commitment, but I shared this video and this first part of a long and deep conversation about the subject that brought us together here today in this circle of dialogue. So, I am Paulo Ueti, a theologian and biblical scholar. I work in the field of the New Testament, gender and development studies. I was a university lecturer for many years in exegesis and theologies of New Testament and liturgy. I'm still doing some teaching in Asia and Europe and Latin America when requested. I'm also part of a dialogue and study group on Benedictine spirituality, and was a Benedictine monk in an ecumenical monastery for many years. I am a member of the Anglican Episcopal Church of Brazil and currently work as a regional director and theological advisor for the Anglican Alliance, which is the Department of Development, Inter-Anglican Cooperation, and the Humanitarian Aid and Resilience Building of the Anglican Communion. I'm also busy with the Theological Education Department for the Anglican Communion as a deputy director for the world who speaks Spanish, Portuguese, and French. I must say that because of all of this, I am a constant student, just like so many of you, on this path that I walk together with so many cultures, languages, churches, and theological and ecclesiological perspectives. As a child of Latin America, of course, I am deeply influenced by the liberation theologies of our continent, and I am also a product of this very context. I carry this perspective, flavors, and the knowledge of this context in which I live, and of so many others when I do theology and try to understand the world. As someone of a Christian spirituality and Benedictine influence, but also as a scholar of Bible and hermeneutics, the liturgy has a privileged place in my spirituality and in my field of research. As we know, behind any text of the Bible, there is always a community of faith, a community that worship. And that worship is always the privileged place to nurture and manifest that faith. The text, the book, is worship manifesting faith, made into writing, made into what we call grammar, which is the all threads of relationships and articulations between people, between them with reality, and between these two with God. It is things made into a book we called Bible. The worship, the liturgy, is also an appropriate channel for influencing and sometimes imposing ideotheologies, being they liberating or colonizing ones. And in a colonized continent, with a colonizing spirit sometimes, it is necessary to recognize this aspect of our liturgy, of our worshiping process and actions. Also, As people of Anglican and Episcopal tradition, it is worth asking what this means in a continent where we live and coexist with the traditions of original people, the indigenous and the Afro-descendants, and all of those immigrants that came into us from the 16th to 21st century. How do these traditions express themselves in our rituals, language, architecture, vocabulary, and aesthetics? It's good just to understand that we are living an immense crisis at various levels of life, especially worth mentioning the health and economic crisis that have ravaged the world, and in Brazil, where I live, the crisis of a perverse fundamentalist obscurantism that is expressed in the way of doing institutional politics, and with the blessing of some evangelical or other churches and religious groups. There is a lot of disappointment, there is a lot of corruption, there is a lot of disillusionment, there is a lot of despair, lack of hope. In the midst of all of this, it is up to us, Christian people or religious people, to ensure hope, and our liturgies are challenged to be that place and the source from which stubborn hope springs and spreads. Surely another word is possible as the motto for the World Social Forum back in time. It seems that the main service, the main diaconal work, the main apostolate that falls to us is to continue on the way, even in the dark and even with unbelief. Regardless of this, Jesus, the Nazarene who is risen, is with us. Even with our illusions, ideological or religious, fetishistic mistakes, which sometimes prevent us from seeing Jesus, it's good to know that he is there. Let's remind the couple of Emmaus, so Cleophas and his wife. They were seeing that person, but they were not recognizing that person as a Jesus. What was preventing them to acknowledge, recognize that person as his fellow Jesus? Probably his perspective on him. His presence, Jesus' presence, does not depend on our ability to recognize him. He is there, even when we don't know or we don't recognize. It is always important to underline that sin has no power anymore, that grace surpasses sin. There is nothing that can keep us apart. So Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit is always with us. It is good to know that, and it is our duty in our worship to ensure that people know it. And because of it, sometimes or probably we should review some of our prayers in our Book of Common Prayer, because sometimes the prayer says otherwise. The prayer sometimes says that sin is capable to keep us apart from God. This is quite a problematic theology and doctrine. This service seems to be fundamental to me, the service of hope, the service of giving birth to hope, facilitating hope. I think that our liturgies are meant to provoke an awareness, to recognize that the one who died, was murdered, is the one who is risen, and he is in our midst. And that is a quote from the Bible. But he, a young man, said to them, "Do not be surprised. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Look at the place where they have put him." God does not depend, as I said before, on our poor abilities to act, to see, to understand. He acts freely and by grace. He collaborates with us. He is a passionate lover who, even without being recognized, walks together, accepts we as we are, accepts our invitation, and sits down at the table with us. We must have the courage to invite him, to open not only our hearts, but our homes. Even if he is not recognized, he does not want to be recognized in the way that the world recognizes some people, by flattering him. This is so childish, so bad. It is he who accepts the invitation to enter the house. to sit at the table and break the bread. From symbol, he becomes the very object, and not only the object, but subject of every saving action. He is the living bread. He is the convener and the way to healing and salvation. And it's important to see he is with us everywhere in our context. This is why contextualization, incarnation is very important. The liturgical space has always been a privilege, locus, place for us to express our hope in the new things to come, because the old things have passed away. So Isaiah 65 and Revelation 21st. As well as a space of liberating grace, of overwhelming passion that transforms everything and everyone. In the liturgy, the Father or the Mother, so the divinity, makes herself known once again through his Son, a living Passover celebrated in the gathering and the prayer of those in service, in diaconal work. The incarnation of God is not only a reality in a theological discourse, a way of understanding the manifestation of God, but it is also an epistemological and missionary mission criterion for our life, for living our life as baptized persons. Liturgy as the memorial of the hours of the day and the life, murder and resurrection of Jesus should only be possible within and from the contexts in which we all live. Our daily lives are full of syncretism and enculturation. The Bible is full of syncretism and enculturation. Let's face it. Let's not be the ones who are looking for a pure race or a pure something. There is not such thing in the Bible, in our lives, and definitely nothing in our liturgical identity. We adapt to our contexts and assimilate customs, dances, food, dresses, and rituals in the places we live. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, sometimes it convenes liberation, sometimes it's just convenient colonization. Why is this sometimes so difficult to understand that in the liturgy and to express this in the liturgy? Why do we sometimes want to repeat something that is no longer appropriated, or that it's bad, perverse, either because it is out of place and time, or because it is unintelligible and communicating nothing of the ministry that is Jesus? The memories about Jesus in the Gospels are a constant conflict between processes of enculturation, respect, and coexistence with people who did not fit in, vis-a-vis people who fit in. Jesus challenged even of his best friends and to understand him as someone who would be a continuation of Roman imperialism and colonization over the Jews. Remember again the disciples of Emmaus, which is, you know, that Luke 24 is almost a perfect liturgical catechesis or liturgy or the worship method. So from not seeing to recognizing, from death to life, from downside to courage, well, etc. It's a perfect fit for the Passover conversation. And why the disciples they were not recognizing him? Because they were waiting, expecting, wanting who will take over a king for the Roman Empire over everybody else. That was definitely not Jesus. So Jesus then challenges his disciples' internal mental and theological models when he presents himself as the suffering servant. Isaiah 42:66. Not the Isaiah. That's our Isaiah 1. Did you do that? To present Jesus as the suffering servant. It seems that this was too much for all of them, and I might say even for us today. We still have a difficulty to understanding that God became incarnate in a human body, in a vulnerable body, in a timing body, in a particular context, to transform the context, not to take it over and carry on in the same way. Instead of recognizing that Jesus is the disruptor of order by being the suffering servant, they made him a king. They have clothed Jesus as a king. They celebrate Jesus as a king. And they treat Jesus as a king. It is so inappropriate from my point of view. And sometimes we keep doing that, actually. The liturgy is called to celebrate the memory of Jesus as the suffering servant and not as the son of David. And I might remind all of you, David is a person certainly without good qualifications. He was a bad king, neither reputation. He has a very bad reputation. Let's review our thinking and image of David. Unfortunately, our hymnology, vocabulary, rituals, and architecture and aesthetics do not help much with this, to express Jesus and his kingdom, Jesus as a suffering servant and his kingdom to us all. Well, I will finish here. So here is one of the challenges that I would like to leave as a provocation for us to continue thinking together. I am sure that my friend Luiz has more to add from the more specific point of view, and I will leave this with him. And I am always open to discuss, to debate, to be challenged. So please just take it as an offer, as a provocation. I want to share and not to prescribe or saying things that is for sure something. It's not. I'm just sharing with you some Latin American perspective, and as a biblical scholar, I do that here. So, and the best energies to all of you, and let's keep in touch. Thank you, Dr. Grieb, and my colleague Luiz, and all of you for having me this time. Goodbye.
I feel like we should applaud. He can't hear us, though. All right. All right. Let me just say that we have already thanked Dr. Ueti many times for that video. Very, very well done and exactly on time. And we wish we could thank him in person. But if all of you here have questions on his presentation, please reach out to us at cax@vts.edu, and we will save and field the questions, pass them on to Dr. Ueti. Our task now, our pleasure now, is to hear from Dr. Coelho, the Reverend Dr. Coelho, who will speak to us about the process of liturgical revision in Brazil. And he's live with us. Welcome, Dr. Coelho. We look forward to your presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello, good afternoon. I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the processes that led to our prayer book revision, but I believe that some of the principles that are underpinned by this revision, they belong to another presentation I gave in Spanish some time ago, so I'm adapting it a little bit on liturgy, enculturation, and power, because we cannot only talk about revising a text, we need to talk about revising liturgy as a whole. So I'd like to talk about a few principles, and then we can engage in conversation later. But the first thing we need to talk about is that we want to enculturate our liturgy, our texts, the way we do liturgy in general. But whenever we talk about enculturation, it's necessary to understand what we want to enculturate. This is very important because in Latina cultures, there's a lot of things, a lot of stuff that we do not want to enculturate, but sometimes is taken for culture. Because we have a colonial heritage that involves prejudices, sexism, ethnic and racial inequality, and above all, an immense disparity of power, which has to do with all the problems we mentioned. So if we want an enculturation of liturgical texts, of our liturgical principles, of our liturgical space and music and everything that has to do with it, that is good, that is adapted to the way of being our people, that produces a truly Latin liturgy that is truly based on the gospel, it is necessary to examine very carefully the roots of this disparity of power. In other words, to decolonize the culture that we want to enculturate in the liturgy, so that we can effectively reflect the best of what our people have to offer to ourselves and to God. So I would like to start with decolonial theory, which is a line of thought that developed starting in the 90s. And one of the major hallmarks of decolonial theory in Latin America was the MCD group: modernity, coloniality, decoloniality, or colonialism and decoloniality, that was started by, among others, Aníbal Quijano, who was a Peruvian sociologist and philosopher. You could not deal with modernity in the Americas without examining its colonial past, because a lot of what is bad that is embedded in our culture comes from this colonial past. Although we claim to be free people and to say that our countries are independent, and a lot of Latina people in general want to celebrate their countries of origin's independence with lots of joy and happiness, the Iberian colonial paradigm is still shaping our form of organization and of our peoples. In other words, the epistemology that guides us is still the same as in the colonial era. The matrix of our institutions, and that includes the church, is mainly European, Iberian colonial, or neo-colonial, borrowing from the United States. That's why it's so difficult for our governments and societies to criticize painful realities, such as the fact that there are so many regions in Latin America where a white elite still holds power, and that there's a genocide of native people and the genocide of Afro-Latina people. Racial democracy doesn't exist. There are a lot of myths about being Latina, that there's like racial equality, that that sexism is over, and that social inequalities have to end. But the true reality is that the independence of those countries didn't change the political, economic, and ecclesial power structure that existed before. And that's why in Latin America, the most successful you are is related to the more white passing you are. You have to look like a European person. You have to behave like a European person. You have to dress like a European person, use language the way a European person does. And colonial heritage is so strong that it's replicated among Latino people, even in the immigrant communities. So if you turn your TV on, I don't know, Telemundo or something like that in the United States, you're going to see soap operas full of white passing Latinos who dress like Europeans and who behave like the elites of the countries where they came from. Those are usually the actors and the actresses and the news outlets, people who speak in Spanish. And the reality is the church still looks like that to a lot of Latina people. Church authorities, both in Latin America and among the communities in the United States, still look like, European white men who carry above all the titles that were inherited from colonial tradition, which is why so many of us call our bishops Dom. That's a colonial title. That's a monarchy that is still inherited from colonial structure. If we can change, so for decolonial theology, it's necessary to review what's most central to colonialism. It's epistemology, the way it describes the world. If we change the way of thinking, teaching, and acting, respecting and including the different cultures of Latin American mosaics, it will be possible to decolonize these structures of power. I have a great deal to talk about liberation theology and its relationship to that, but Paulo has already talked a little bit about it, so I'm going to skip this part. But it's necessary to remind us that liberation theology has lost its power for many reasons. One of them is because it flirted with academia for a long time. And when it flirted with academia, it lost a bit of its power from the base. Also, it failed to properly address some of the new topics when it comes to describing who the oppressed are, which includes queer theology and gender theology and ethnic and racial relationships. It took too long to stop talking about the poor and uniquely the poor and understand that there are intersectionalities to what it is to be oppressed in Latin American structures as well. But liberation theology remains as the vernacular through which we can examine the way we do liturgy and try to decolonize it, to remove the structures of power that still exist in our liturgies. The paradigm of God's preferential option for the oppressed continues, but decolonial theology invites us to listen to them and work with them whose cultures have always been isolated and rejected to build a Latin ecumenical and plural Christianity. The historical critical method may be important, but the popular interpretation of Latin cultural diversity also needs to be considered. So the church liturgy and its forms may be important, but they need to be adapted to the many existing cultural expressions. And this is very important when we revise liturgical texts, because they have to look like something that can be adapted to a variety of scenarios. And the structure of our church that is based on the European canonical model also needs to be revisited to guarantee an equal and respectful distribution of power to all peoples, colors, genders, and cultures. A few topics about this. The first of them is horizontal power. Latin churches in general, and that encompasses both Spanish or Portuguese-speaking congregations in North American communities and dioceses all over Latin America, they tend to have power that is so much concentrated in the hands of a few clergymen. It still follows a colonial Iberian epistemology. It's not within modernity. That's not what we want to see happen in there. The horizontal church we want, and that's the church that engenders a horizontal liturgy. It needs to be less Eurocentric and more culturally diverse. Through the study of the Bible, liturgy, and church governance, we have to hear not only the voices of leaders who reflect European epistemology, like myself, to a certain degree, nor the voices of the Latin elites who often think they really know what it is to enculturate the church, but only add aesthetic elements to it. So enculturation, that is basically folklorization. It is necessary to hear all the voices of all the people of God. So you have to horizontalize the church. If the church is only adding liturgical elements without adding the voices from within, it's just a folklorized church. It's not a real enculturated church. That's what we want to do when we talk about a horizontal liturgy. So I would offer, first of all, Chipungo's two basic paths, which are dynamic equivalence and creative assimilation. Creative assimilation is basically when you adapt cultural elements derived from different sources and do not contradict the Christian character of the liturgy. And dynamic equivalence, which is what exists in the Ordo, in Christian liturgies, that can be expressed in the customs, symbols, and elements of a local culture. What usually happens is that people don't let church authorities don't let the people of the church do it. And there are manifold cultures. a group decides for them what is going to be added and what should not be added, and what elements that we would add. So it would look more Latin, but it only looks on the outside because it's truly just a folklorized liturgy. It's folklore added to liturgy, doesn't impact people's lives. But if you don't look at the language that we use, with all the inconsistencies of Romance languages and all the problems that lie when you actually use a language that was a language of power for 500 years, if you don't do that, you're not horizontalizing the liturgy. So our liturgical texts, they use the worst of Romance languages. Inherent sexism under what we call the norm of the language, right? So for some time, liberal and feminist circles have tried to overcome what we call in Romance languages the neutral masculine pronoun. So people have used the X, the at symbol, the E, several different possibilities, because in Spanish and in Portuguese and in French and in many Romance languages, if you have 999 women and a male dog, they become a plural male. Some jobs, some titles, they're all in masculine terms. And when we use expressions like el celebrante or el obispo in the liturgy, we're actually emphasizing an idea that being male is the norm and being female is an exception. When we say todos juntos, it means that being a male in the midst of a lot of women is the norm, and being a woman is an exception. If we don't pay attention to that, we continue imposing the same colonial, Iberian, and neo-colonial estadounidense oppression that have existed for so long. The excessive use of capital letters to refer to God also communicates a high and ascendant Christology. So this tendency to use pronouns to God that are always capitalized in Romance languages show us a God that's very far from us, a God that follows colonial structures, that is still tied to the European monarchies that once colonized Latin America and imposed a highly hierarchical society. This God uses capital letters for everything. He, his, this, God Almighty. Under him, the bishops who are dons, they have inherited, they're dons, they're like the monarchs given by God to the people. Under them, the priests, who are usually male, many of them white, who speak with a proper Romance language and whose roots can be tied to Europe much more than the people they serve. If we don't change that, we may add all of those folklore elements to the liturgy, the colors, the sounds and the instruments, but our church essentially remains a colonial church with, enculturated paraphernalia. There are several ways that make it possible to circumvent these problems with language, keeping the official rules of the language, and arrive at a less sexist text that is clear and simple, but beautiful and culturally appropriate. But to do this, our commissions, the ones that revise the liturgy, need to include the people who get affected by that. So we need to hear how women, minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities pray, how they cry out to God, how they explore more creative scenarios, creative options for expansive use of the language. And always ask yourself, how do oppressed people read this liturgical text? Do they see each other in it? Go on for the last few observations. How about our liturgical spaces? Many are not creative adaptations of old buildings against the proposals of the liturgical movement. A lot of them are just a very simple adaptation. They move the altar just a little bit, But all the steps, the position, the way people face each other, everything else remains the same way it used to be 500 years ago, when Europeans colonized the Americas. The altars were moved, but only a little. All possible spatial divisions that isolate ministers from the rest of the assembly remain, thus limiting the physical participation of the faithful. Steps, communion areas, platforms, they serve as barriers that put people in place and create a symbolic division between two different groups. People on the side of the altar, who are already the ones associated with the elites, usually, they receive all the attention and perpetuate deep hierarchical divisions. The amount of artistic and decorative elements found around the altar, they may be tied to a certain culture, but if you do not include the subject matter, this means the people of that culture, means nothing. It's just folklore. Sacred images must have a symbolic meaning, but also a culturally sensitive one. There is no high or low in sacred art. There is sacred art. If it connects people to God, then it's suited to the purpose for which it was created, which is why it's much better to use our own artists in our midst than to purchase something from a vendor, and especially to explore what popular arts and crafts are available in the midst of the congregations. And what about liturgical music and preaching in this new context, where you have changed the language, the revision of the liturgy, where you have put the church in a horizontal position, both in hierarchy and in liturgical matter? Some of the issues related to the use of inclusive language have already been proposed in this presentation. So we're not going to talk about using inclusive language in music because we talked about it when it comes to liturgical texts. But I would just like to briefly suggest that using popular musical rhythms does not necessarily mean enculturation. You just don't throw Pescador de Hombres in the liturgy and make it Latina sounding. You just don't get whatever pieces of cloth you bought when you traveled to Peru for the last time and put on the altar. It does not make it enculturated in a Latina scenario. It is necessary that the performance, the musical instruments, and the lyrics are authentic, as well as those who compose these musical pieces. This is also true for homilies and readings. Our people, they preach, they share the gospel, they talk, they engage in conversations in a different way, which is why I cannot keep with those 15-minute limits, because I am not, a WASP, so I cannot do that. We cannot go to seminary like when I was in Sewanee and I had to preach for 5 minutes. It's difficult. We talk a lot. We share. We cry. We give space for people to communicate. Our sermons cannot follow another model. Our liturgy cannot follow what a book says. But there are several questions, and I'm going to stop here. And I would like to share some more experiences if you want to talk about it a little bit. For now, let us reflect. What should we remove from our liturgy to make it truly horizontal and enculturated in text, music, church hierarchy, liturgical spaces, and everything else? Thank you.
Dr. Coelho, thank you very much for that. We do have time for discussion, and I'm sure there are many questions that have been growing up in the room. I want to take just a second and privilege of the chair for a minute and ask you about something that we talked about an earlier time, and that is quinceanera, because I think it's the perfect illustration of what you were saying about importing into a liturgy something that is supposedly Latin when in fact it's colonial one more time. Would you say just a word about the tradition, how the quinceanera traditions got imported into the liturgies?
Me?
Yes.
For me to say that. Yes. This is one of the hot topics, and I'm always happy to bring some controversy to this conversation. A lot of what has been done, it's not only in the United States, all over Latin America. But in the United States, usually immigrant communities tend to retain some traditions that were let go in other places. So it happens more in the US. Is this whole adoption of quinceañeras as a liturgical element because it defines a culture? But in its essence, it's basically a colonial tradition from New Spain, right? And also it's an Iberian tradition. It's Portuguese too. It used to be very common in Brazil, even when I was a child. It's kind of like an Iberian bar mitzvah, but it was for women. So it was a way of showing them they're showing to the society that they were already old enough to get married when they get 15 years old. So it was basically
the white dress helps. The white dress and the veils.
Yeah, to society. And in many Latin American countries, this has been, discussed by feminist scholars. Do we really want to keep something like that? Because it's only for girls. Only girls have that. Because women, what happens to them? They need to marry when they get to the age of 15. Do we need to keep this tradition? And what I see is that sometimes we bring traditions to our liturgy and we don't reflect upon them, because we could do something like that. If we want to create a rite of passage, why not turn this into an inclusive way of doing confirmation? Have all the boys and girls who reach the age of 15 dressed in white, and let's say it's our confirmation, confirmación de quinceañera. I don't know how to say that. But why do we keep putting all those girls? If our church preaches that women have equal standing before God, that women can be clergy. So sometimes we adopt traditions without much reflection. And they're actually given a message, and that is a message that's all over Latina churches and Anglican churches as well, that women cannot reach some spaces. And we must reflect, because liturgy has symbolic meaning. How many women clergy do we have in Latina and Latin American dioceses, in Latin American ministries everywhere? Very few. If you compare to our, Anglo-Saxon brothers and sisters, you have way more women clergy. So we are getting this colonial stuff, and for the sake of enculturation and culture, right, putting it in our liturgy when we should be questioning it or adapting it using this grammar of Chupungu. Another example, just for me to finish, is the whole stuff about First Communion. It's all over Latin America, and it's in some communities in the United States as well. We are a church, both at the local level, right? Most Latin American churches either ascribe to the 79 Prayer Book or to a book that was influenced by it. And the ILC, the International Anglican Liturgical Consultation, we are a church that proclaims that baptism is full inclusion in God's church.
Amen.
Why do we prevent babies and infants until the age of First Communion in our communities to receive the sacrament? That's what Juan Oliver would call excommunicating children in Latina churches. And he got, lots of people got very mad. Oh, it's pastoral sensitivity. No, we're actually compromising one of the central aspects of our theology, one central principle of the liturgical movement, which most provinces of the Anglican Communion have embraced, just for the sake of enculturating something that is not even ours. We can have something like that. We can have a solemn communion as a rite of passage. But, these are the questions we must make. What are the colonial and traditionalist structures that we keep in our liturgy for the sake of enculturation, but it's just like folklore added to the liturgy, and it compromises our theology? Okay.
Thank you very much. We do have a question from the floor, and I expect we will get some in the chat box in a minute. Please come in and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Catherine Campbell. I'm the vicar of 2 Latino congregations in Arlington, Virginia. I agree with a lot of what you've said, but pastorally, there's always a question of what to enculturate and what not to. I agree that the prayer book needs to be changed so that there is a more inclusive and open theology in there. But just with the topic of quinceañeras and First Communion, my problem is a pastoral one, and that is, I, as a woman I was born and raised in Mexico. So I try to explain to all of my 15-year-olds at one quinceañera that they do not need to, but the pressure from the society around them is so much so that I can't not do quinceañeras and be pastoral. But what I try to do is emphasize their service into the community. And so community outreach through quinceañeras. And so I try not to make it sort of a rite of passage to get married, but a rite of passage to be able to go into the community and serve as women leaders and feminist leaders. But pastorally, it's very hard for me to take away from la quinceañera, especially with Central Americans. I mean, it's very difficult for me to do that. But I agree with you. And then full inclusion at Primera Comunión, full inclusion is baptism, and we celebrate that. We do have a course called the Gran Comunión, which is when they're 8 years old, they take a course. And part of that is the pressure that we have from parents that still have a Roman Catholic background, and to try to appease some of the grandparents or folks that are still Roman Catholic, to be able to make sure that they have the documentation that they need, so that if they do get married in the Roman Catholic Church further on the line, they have that documentation. And so it's more of a pastoral need to the grandparents, but the kids are full inclusion after baptism. So part of it is, I agree with you, but there's pastoral considerations that we need to take that are very difficult at times. So that's a comment. And just
I actually wanted to polemize. So the idea was to come up with questions and experiences like yours, which is pretty much what I have done and what I would do under the same circumstances. Remember that I connected a little bit the concept of quinceañeras with bar mitzvah, because what happened? Did the Jews remove it from their liturgy? Or, I mean, it's a very bad comparison, but nowadays you see girls are also doing their bat mitzvahs. And so there are ways of adapting it, and we need to understand that sometimes a grandmother wants to see that happen. But my criticism is not about people like you who are trying to do it. And I commend you for being the vicar of those congregations. I commend your congregation for accepting a woman priest, because sometimes, and I've seen it more than once, our clergy counterpart don't even tell the congregation that such a thing exists, that women can be clergy. So sometimes we're disguising our congregations as Roman Catholic churches, and we're failing to instruct them properly. So those scenarios exist. Sometimes the grandmother wants to see the First Communion. That's why Juan Oliver, the same one who says it's excommunicating when you say no, don't get communion, proposes what is called a Solemn Communion. But do not lie to the people, which some people blatantly lie, and say that the children cannot receive communion because under our church they can. What will happen a lot of times, and that's happened to me, you go and prepare everybody for the baptism, you tell the parents they can receive communion. If you want a solemn rite later when they're older, we can do all the catechesis for that, because we actually have to do catechisms. It's called a catechumenate. We have to do that to children throughout their lives. But they may receive communion. The parents don't let it for cultural reasons. I cannot force it, but I cannot deny it, or I cannot pretend it doesn't exist. And a lot of times that's what I see happening. And a lot of times it gets into the liturgy. So eventually you will see a rite appearing for that. A rite that just draws from the Roman Catholic rite exactly like that, without explaining what it's meant to be. So there is this pastoral element that we have to hold on to, but at the same time, we have to try to challenge the people who we serve, that our church presupposes, or our way of seeing the gospel presupposes, more equality and more gender equality and more racial equality, and we need to have more representation in that regard.
Thank you, both of you, for that conversation, which is very helpful to all of us. Sean, would you come to the mic? Dr. Sean Stroud, I believe you two know each other from International Liturgy.
I know from Societas Liturgica.
Yes.
Nice to see you, Sean.
Nice to see you. So I believe I'm correct in saying that the 2015 revision of your prayer book is the second non-English prayer book to have indigenously written prayers in it, with the New Zealand prayer book being the first. I believe I'm correct with that. Could you talk a little bit about that? In particular, I'm thinking about how we can encourage and resource other non-English speaking provinces in the Anglican Communion to further that work and move beyond translation to actually indigenously written prayers.
The first thing is we need to have more active participation of the subject matter of our liturgy, which is the people, right? It's work for the people, so we need to hear from the people. I cannot believe our revision of the BCP would be as successful as it has been if we hadn't have more women than men in the commission. That's the first thing that I would like to say. We had more women than men. So for a moment, we had more women voicing their opinions on sexist language in a way that's never existed before. However, in many Latin American churches, and the leadership of Latina ministries is still concentrated, right, in the hands of a few men. So we don't have enough participation in terms of what commissions determine it. Also, the way we decide upon things is slightly different from the way North Americans decide, right? The United States was built on very democratic principles from the scratch, as opposed to Latin American Latina cultures that inherited these structures of power from colonial times, have faced dictatorships for most of the 20th century. And a lot of time people don't know how to voice their opinion and don't understand a voting system. This means that sometimes we need to find creative ways of hearing the voices of those who are the subject matter of our liturgy. Otherwise, you're not going to speak up. And those of you who work with Latina congregations, you know this exactly, because this is common to Latino people all over the continent. If they don't like something, a lot of times they will not tell you. They just move, leave, they'll disappear. You won't even hear about them anymore. They act in a different way. So the liturgical revision process needs to include those voices, which is why I also commend the Indaba system that we established in Brazil, because it was because of the Indaba system that we got to the circles and to the commissions that led to the new prayer book, because it was chosen by small groups without, scaring simple people, without having humble people have to speak up in the middle of a diocesan council or a synod and voice their opinion. And we created groups that led to the formation of the final group. And also because of the Indaba system, we got to the vote that changed the canons to allow same-sex marriage. It would have never passed if we led it to the clergy and the bishops. It was because people could speak up in small groups and move on to other small groups, and move on to other small groups, and move on to other small groups, and then their voice was heard. So when we're dealing with Latino people, you cannot think about the same structures that you see in the Anglo-Saxon church. You won't have somebody from parish so-and-so that will speak up, raise their hand in the middle of a synod and say, I disagree with this. It's much more difficult. So we need to find other ways of talking to those people and hearing their voices, right?
Thank you. I need to stop this, but I want to underline the word indaba, which is an African word, and it involves a process where everyone in the room speaks in turn, and one person invites another to speak, and the whole room gets to express an opinion rather than just the one or two people who feel most comfortable or empowered by the system. Dr. Coelho, you've given us lots to think about. We are grateful, very grateful to you. If you didn't get a chance to ask your question, either in the chat or in the room, I have a feeling we could go on for several hours. This will go on YouTube very shortly. You can hear it again, and there's lots to think about, and we will continue this conversation as best we can. In the meantime, our thanks go to you, and also again to Paulo Ueti, and to our wonderful interpreter, Rafael Salemo. Thank you so much, all of you, for today's forum hour. We are greatly in your debt. Thank you. Go in peace.